Go ahead and have a seat. And welcome again, and grace to you and peace in the name of the triune God. Our reading this morning, if you want to find it, it'll be up on the screen in a moment, is from Mark chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. We're going to get to that here in a second. Before we do that, I want to share this experience I had on Monday. I recently discovered that there's this sort of pop-up museum here in Los Angeles. Some of you probably know about this. It's called the Museum of Failure. Have you heard of this? You should go check it out. It's not a bad cost to get in. You can kind of peruse it. It's at your own pace. But it's called the Museum of Failure. So I was like, I have to go check this out. It's basically this room full of failures in mostly like industry and technology, things that people tried to make that didn't quite work. It's a pretty fun exhibit, but I wanted to start with just a few of the things that I experienced there. So we have our first picture here. Some of you might remember this. I may have even owned one at one point. This is made by Fisher-Price in 1987. It's called PXL 2000. This fancy piece of equipment, you can see the cassette tape there, records 4 minutes of video on each side of the tape. It takes 6 batteries, AA batteries, to run it for 7 minutes. Just process that for a second. And it was so loud when it was running that anything you shot, it automatically ruined the audio. So it was just muffled sound as you watched it. The next one here is called No More Woof. Some of you may have even invested in this once. You should go read their website. It's a very interesting website. But this was designed in 2013. This is a headphone that you can put on a dog that will transfer its brainwaves. So they can understand English when you speak to it. Yeah. 2013. I guess that's something. 2007, the phone finger was invented. In case you have just this disdain for smudges on your phone screen, every time you use your phone, you can strap on one of these fingers and then take it off because who wants to walk around with a phone finger on? Super practical. In 1996, they invented a Pringle alternative, a fat-free Pringle, a health-conscious version. The big ingredient to this was this ingredient called olestra, which if you're in the health world may ring a bell to you. It's supposed to be the thing that cut the fat, right? So you can eat Pringles without worrying about all of the fat that was in them. Unfortunately, side effects include cramps and diarrhea. Completely works. Although I would argue that might just be all of the Pringles you ate. They just might work against you. In 1994, there was this invention called Thirsty Dog and Thirsty Cat. This was designed to replace the tap water that we usually give our pets. So you can buy some of this fancy water, pour it in a bowl, and not give your dogs the nasty tap water. And then in 2003, we have the next one here, they tried to do it again with this water for dogs featuring such flavors as gutter water, hose water, puddle water, and my favorite, toilet water. Right? And then finally, this is my favorite one I saw, and of course you'll know this story or at least recognize, probably not the device, but this little company in 1975 called Kodak. Ever heard of them? Kodak invented the first digital camera. Did you know that? 1975. Of course, what's interesting about Kodak is that they famously refused to change their business model. So they died on the hill of printing photos when the entire world was going digital. And they were the first ones to invent it. Talk about being stubborn in your business model, right? Not seeing the future with your own invention. And of course, what's ironic and interesting to me is that the kicker is that in 2012, Kodak finally went bankrupt, right? Which is the same year, interestingly enough, that Facebook bought Instagram, which are two big photo sharing, amongst other things, platforms, right? Kind of symbolic. Of course, there's lots of things. Could not have gone through all of it with you, but it's super fun. But part of what's fun about this exhibit, I think, as I was walking through, was sort of the debate that goes through your mind. Is this actually a failure? Or is this just how, industry works, right? You try things and you fail, but it, paves the way for the next thing, So you have this kind of fun conversation going on in your mind. But it got me thinking, actually, about the story that we're going to read today, because this idea of failure comes up in relationship to Jesus in this story in a really interesting way. And by the way, we already said it, but if you came in a little bit late, we have some palm fronds back there. Just going to encourage you to wave your hand. If you didn't get one, you'll need one by the end of the service. We do very, very little tactile stuff, and so I love that you can have a palm frond in your hand while we're talking about some of this stuff. So if you don't have it, raise your hand and Steve will get you one. But like I said, today is Palm Sunday. This is the beginning of Holy Week. This is the most important week in the church year. This week right here, starting with Palm Sunday, the final week of Jesus' life. And every year on Palm Sunday, we read this story that we often refer to as the Triumphal entry of Jesus. This is when he rides into Jerusalem and the people shout Hosanna and they wave branches at him and lay their coats on the ground. It's one of my favorite Sundays of the year, not just because I get to say the word palm frond. It gives me great pleasure to throw this word out there. It just means branch, but it's fun to say frond. But I love this story for a couple of reasons. Partly because it raises this really interesting question about who God is as Jesus rides into Jerusalem and what this work of redemption is that God is doing. It raises this interesting question there. But I also like this story because of the way that it invites us to question whether or not we see Jesus for who he is, how he's been talking about himself this whole time, versus Jesus as we want him to be. This is the story that sort of brings that together. Jesus for who he is versus Jesus who we want him to be. This is actually why I think calling this story the Triumphal entry is actually a little bit misleading. Most of your Bibles probably have it titled as the Triumphal entry. I think it's a little misleading, especially the way Mark tells the story, because there's nothing in this moment that's actually very triumphal about what Jesus does here. The triumph comes later, and not in a way that we would have expected. So I've actually started to call it the so-called Triumphal entry, just to raise a little bit of doubt about what's happening here, the so-called Triumphal entry, because there's really another entry that Jesus makes in the Gospel of Mark when he goes into Jerusalem that's actually his triumphal entry, and it's an entry that looks like failure. But it actually ends up being something else. And so that's what I want to do today. I want to look at these two entries, his first one and his last one, and to consider a couple of things here that I'm just going to put up on the screen for you to look at as I talk through them, just real quickly, to consider how Jesus turns upside down their expectations of himself. That's one thing I want you to think about. And how he turns upside down their belief that a crucified Messiah is a failed Messiah. And then to consider what it means to say that we are followers of this crucified and resurrected Jesus. Just a couple of things to be thinking about during this sermon. So we're going to read the text here. If you have a Bible, it's Mark 11, beginning at verse 1, or you can follow along on the screen. But it goes like this. As they approached Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately as you enter, you will find a colt tied there, on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' you say, 'The Lord has need of it,' and immediately he will send it back here." They went away and found the colt tied at the door outside the street, and they untied it. Some of the bystanders were saying to him, "What are you doing, untying the colt?" They spoke to them just as Jesus had told them, and they gave them permission. They brought the colt to Jesus and put their coats on it, and he sat on it. And then he spread their coats in the road, and others spread leafy branches, which they had cut from the fields. Those who went in front and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." Jesus entered Jerusalem and came into the temple. And after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So this scene opens with Jesus and the disciples approaching Jerusalem. But it says that they stopped short of it at the Mount of Olives. And I just want to show us, just to give us a visual here, what the geography looks like. You might not be able to see all of this. You can see Jerusalem, you can see the temple, you can see Bethany, and Bethany is on that right, kind of in the middle, right under Bethany is the Mount of Olives. And you can see kind of the mountain would be there. And then to the left just a little bit is the Garden of Gethsemane, still outside the city, and then the temple would be the place that you would have entered to go in there. This is where Jesus is right now. He's coming from Bethany to Bethany. He goes into the temple, he looks around, and leaves. The Mount of Olives is an important place in the Bible. It's a very important place in the Bible. Hey, Anthony, I'm getting a little feedback here. I'm just going to have you tune that down. And so for Mark, we read this detail here that Jesus stops at the Mount of Olives. It's supposed to be this cue for us. This isn't just like, this is where Jesus is. This is a cue, an important cue for what's happening here. There's this reference in the book of Zechariah that we think Mark is drawing from here that's really important to pay attention to. Zechariah, of course, from your devotional reading last night in the book of Zechariah, you were all there, yes, reading and memorizing the entire book.
Yeah.
Was this, he was this prophet, I know, me too. He was this prophet from the Old Testament, really kind of an unknown prophet. We only really hear about him in moments like this, where, we know Isaiah and Jeremiah, but there's these other ones. This guy named Zechariah. He was this prophet during the Babylonian exile. It was during one of the worst times in Israel's history, after they had lost everything. I was thinking about what the Babylonian exile would have been like, and the best I could come up with in our culture would have been this equivalent to total bankruptcy. It's total bankruptcy, it's total asset seizure. They come in and take everything, and to top it all off, it's deportation. Right? Bankruptcy, asset seizure, can't say seizure, and then deportation. Like, it's the worst moment in their life as God's people, and Zechariah is one of the prophets during that time. The entire world had been turned upside down during the Babylonian exile. But there's this moment where Zechariah says this. He starts to talk about this day. Imagine the worst day of your life, the worst moment ever. Everything's gone. You're deported. You're not home. No family, no friends. There's this moment when this prophet says that God will come and save them. There's this day to come when God will come and save them. And there's a lot to say about this passage. Some of it will sound really harsh, and I can't talk about all that right now because I just want us to see this one thing that's happening here. But we need to understand this context a little bit. It's Zechariah chapter 14. I have the words up here if you want to follow along, but it starts out this way. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil that was taken from you will be divided among you. Which means they're going to get it back. What was taken from you will then be returned to you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and the houses plundered, and the women ravished. That's the part I can't talk about today. And half of the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Long story short about this passage, and again, there's too much to set up here, but it's supposed to depict this awful situation that Jerusalem is in. And it is awful. This time, the worst moment in Israel's history, this situation, total chaos. Verse 3. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on the day of battle. So good news, God is with us. But then check this out. In that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east. The Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will be moved toward the north and the other half toward the south. You will flee by the valley of my mountains. Which basically means that God will provide a way out for them. This way of redemption. Joel, if we go back to that image for a second, you can see what he means by this. That mountain will split to the north and to the south. And where the mountain is, there will be a pathway, right, to the other side, so they can get out of the city of Jerusalem. And so here's the thing that I want us to see, that Zechariah is setting up here. The Mount of Olives, if you're in Israel, if you're shaped by the story, these scriptures have come to shape everything you know about God and his story in the world. The Mount of Olives, you knew, was the location that God would come from. When God would show up and save God's people and fight for them and restore all things and be Lord over creation. That's where you would look to see the Messiah. This is the cue Mark is setting up for us about Jesus here. He's got the Mount of Olives. He's coming. They would know that this is a Messiah-like moment. They might even be watching to see what he does next. But it doesn't go the way it was supposed to, right? And a lot of it has to do with the way Mark is trying to tell the story about Jesus here. Because not only is Mark setting up this Hebrew image about the Messiah coming from the Mount of Olives, he's also borrowing this other image from Rome, from first century Roman culture. So you've got this Hebrew image of the Messiah on the Mount of Olives, and then there's this other image he's working with about Jesus as the warrior king. It's this image from Rome. You've got the Hebrew image of the Messiah and the Roman image of the warrior king. It was this first century idea that basically goes like this. Again, this would have been common knowledge to first century folk, but in that context, if you were a general or a ruler or Caesar himself, it was customary for you, if you went and conquered a city in battle, to go into that city, to go into their temple, to go into their worship space, and to make a sacrifice to your God. Because that showed that you had defeated that city, that you were now in charge. Your God was bigger than their God, right? So that was the gesture. This would have been a normal thing to do. This is the warrior king kind of mentality, showing your power over the city, symbol of victory. And so Mark is kind of bringing these two images together here. It's like he's combining this Messiah on the Mount of Olives with Jesus as the warrior king. It's Jesus, warrior king on a horse, right, going into the temple. This is kind of the image he's painting here. Go get a colt, he says. He goes into the temple at the end of the story. It's Jesus as Messiah coming from the Mount of Olives to defeat God's enemies. If we didn't know any better, it looks like Jesus is about to make his move on the city. He's going to conquer it. He's going to bring in the reign of God. He's going to do all of the things that Israel had ever hoped that the Messiah would do. And yet for Mark, the way he tells this story, he completely subverts that idea. He completely subverts this idea because what he's really doing here, what Mark is really doing here is making a parody of this entire thing. He's making a parody of this entire Hebrew idea of the Messiah from the Mount of Olives, this parody of mostly Jesus as warrior king. It's this so-called triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem right now. If you look closer at the details, you notice a couple of things. Look at the horse that he's riding on. It begins with his ride, right? You always got to look at how people show up. This is the thing that he tells them to do. Go get me a colt, he says. A colt is a young, adolescent male horse. Small, scrawny, barely able to walk around. If you Google images of a colt, like, it's ridiculous. They're small cats. Like, they're large cats, but they're small. They wobble, like you see them, they have the quick legs because they can't even stretch their legs out. It's a colt, he tells them to go get. Anyone in power, Caesar, Pilate, Herod, they would have seen this as a joke. Go get a colt, he says. And what's more, and this is really interesting, we know this from history that the scriptures don't tell us this, but one of the things we know is that right around this time, on special occasions like Passover, or anytime the Hebrews would gather, or anyone that Rome was in charge over, but definitely during Passover, Rome would show up too. Rome would show up in the city as well to remind everyone of who's in charge. So if it was Caesar or if it was Pilate or one of the other rulers or generals, they would show up and they would parade into town and they would show off their armies and their military power, and they would wave the Roman symbols around, and they would go into Jerusalem during one of the most important times, the Passover time, to remind them not to get any big ideas. To remind them that they are in charge too, because the Jews had a history of rebellion. Because they had a history of God coming to save them, and people would claim to be Messiah and show up, and there would be little revolutions and revolts, but they would never pan out to much. They would never build up into anything. So as the Jews gathered for worship for Passover, Rome would show up too, and they'd show everyone who's in charge. So you have to imagine how this works. On the one side of Jerusalem, there's Rome parading into town with their pomp and circumstance, right? And on the other side of town, there's